This is China Observer, I'm Daniel Hall. Today we've got some shocking news from the South China Sea to share with you. The brutal details of China's cruel assault on the Philippines have been exposed in a jaw-dropping video. Before 6 a.m. on June 17th, two RHIBs, or rigid-hulled inflatable boats, from the Philippine Navy arrived at the stranded BRP Sierra Madre at Second Thomas Shoal to carry out a rotation and resupply mission. In the video, you can see Chinese Coast Guard personnel threatening the Philippine boat with knives, axes, and other deadly weapons, trying to tie a rope to it to tow it away. Reports indicate that at least 8 Chinese Coast Guard RHIBs surrounded the Philippine boat. The footage shows at least 7 Chinese vessels with blue dots marking the Philippine Navy's ships. By around 6:15 a.m., the Chinese Coast Guard started tying ropes to the Philippine boats, attempting to drag them away from the stranded ship. One Filipino RHIB was caught between 2 Chinese Coast Guard ships and was forcibly towed away from the BRP Sierra Madre. The remaining Philippine RHIBs were surrounded, and the outnumbered Philippine Navy personnel had their weapons and personal belongings confiscated. The Chinese then destroyed the outboard motors, rendering the boats inoperable, and abandoned them. Around 11 a.m., the Philippine Coast Guard's RHIBs rescued the damaged RHIB and its crew. The injured sailors received emergency medical treatment from the armed forces of the Philippines. During this violent clash, the Chinese Coast Guard fired tear gas to escalate the chaos, continuously sounded alarms to disrupt communications, and used blinding strobe lights to impair the vision and coordination of the Philippine soldiers. These intense close-up videos were captured by a body camera worn by a Philippine police officer on the RHIB. This footage starkly contradicts China's claims that their actions were professional and restrained. This is what's actually going on in the South China Sea. For a full 12 hours, there was intense standoff outside the lagoon of the Second Thomas Shoal, finally winding down at 4 p.m. In the end, the Philippine vessels were unable to deliver the much-needed supplies to the stranded ship. The Second Thomas Shoal Lagoon is about 9 miles long and less than 4 miles wide. The stranded Philippine ship is located in the central northern part of the lagoon, where over a dozen Philippine soldiers are stationed. In the cramped lagoon, there are at least 20 Chinese militia boats and several Coast Guard ships stationed, blocking the way for Philippine supply ships. The soldiers on the stranded ship are facing a dire situation with supplies running low. This nightmare scenario has persisted since the standoff between the Philippines and China began on March 23rd. This isn't the first confrontation. On April 23rd, a Chinese Coast Guard ship intercepted a Philippine patrol boat near the Second Thomas Shoal, narrowly avoiding collision. On May 16th, about 100 Filipino activists, followed by Chinese Coast Guard ships, had to change their plan to deliver supplies to the Second Thomas Shoal and instead headed to other disputed islands. On June 4th, 4 airdrop packages from the Philippines landed on the water, but one was picked up by a Chinese ship. When they opened it, they found biscuits and food meant to be a lifeline for the Filipino soldiers. However, the Chinese discarded the precious supplies into the sea, ignoring the desperate need of the Filipinos. Every day is an ordeal for the Filipino soldiers on the stranded ship. Without long-term resupply, they will eventually succumb to hunger or disease. The empty, stranded ship, under the Chinese threat, could be towed away at any moment. For the Philippine military, this resupply mission was a race against death. The root cause of this conflict lies in China's Territorial Sea Law, implemented on June 15th, which quietly changed the rules of the game in the South China Sea. This law allows China to detain and inspect foreign ships and personnel for up to 60 days within their so-called sovereign waters, and even permits the Chinese Coast Guard to use force against foreigners at will. Just 2 days after this new law was born, the Chinese Navy wasted no time on going on the offensive. The Philippine Navy's resupply mission became its first victim. The Chinese Coast Guard seized this opportunity to launch an attack, desperate for a military win in these waters. What may seem like a glorious battle for China comes down to trampling of another nation's sovereignty and the lives of its people. China's Territorial Sea Law blatantly disregards established international law, like an arrogant tyrant allowing no challenge to its dominance. For the Filipinos, this incident is undoubtedly a humiliation. But from a historical perspective, such humiliation often becomes a spark for a nation's resistance. The Chinese Coast Guard might have to live in fear in the days to come. After all, this is the third time Filipinos have suffered at the hands of the Chinese Coast Guard in the South China Sea. Driven by anger and hatred, the Philippines might take some unexpected retaliatory actions. The machine guns on the stranded Philippine ship keep close watch on every move around them. The Chinese Navy may be itching for some battle experience as the existing People's Liberation Army has no actual combat experience. On the Chinese internet, some keyboard warriors caught up in a nationalist frenzy are extremely hawkish. Some of them may be paid government writers, known as the 50-cent army, while others may just be hopped up on Chinese military propaganda movies. As for a tiny reef, China has no problem stirring up trouble. They twist facts and make up lies. They create laws to give themselves free rein to provoke other nations, seize ships, and even open fire. This behavior is testing the limits of international society, seeing how far they can push it. But they forget the international community isn't their playground, and the South China Sea isn't their backyard. A responsible major power should uphold regional peace and stability, not constantly challenge the rules and stir up trouble. Ignoring the sovereignty of other countries and flouting international law will only isolate China more on the world stage. This conflict may mark the beginning of China's attempt at hard imperialism. According to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the Second Thomas Shoal is within the Philippines' 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. Meanwhile, China's nearest territory is over 600 miles away. Under international law, China has no jurisdiction over this area. Their so-called historic rights were dismissed by the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague in 2016. Moreover, as a signatory on the UNCLOS, China should adhere to every clause of the convention and respect the sovereignty and interests of other nations. But instead of accepting the International Court's ruling, China has intensified its aggression and encroachment of the Philippines. They think they can rule the international community doing whatever they please. But actions certainly have consequences. The United States and the Philippines, as members of the international community, have a responsibility and duty to uphold the dignity of international law. The statement from the U.S. State Department spokesperson reaffirmed America's commitment to the Philippines. The 1951 U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty stands like an unbreakable fortress, providing the Philippines with a shield of safety. The U.S. Defense Secretary's remarks made it clear to the world that America will not stand by while the Philippines' sovereignty and interests are violated. The stance of the Philippine military is equally resolute. Facing China's actions, they did not retreat or compromise, but stood up to defend their dignity and rights. Philippines President Bongbong Marcos took a clear stance against Beijing, saying their island's rights are sacred and inviolable. Although 70% of the Philippine public is ready for war with China, this incident at the Second Thomas Shoal may not be enough to ignite a full-blown conflict. In this complex geopolitical chess game, every player still hasn't fully positioned their pieces. The South China Sea is a goldmine of interests for so many countries. And the Second Thomas Shoal? It's right at the center of it all. Rumor has it, beneath its tiny reef lies a treasure trove of oil and gas resources that are a lure for many nearby nations. Right at this delicate moment, Russian President Vladimir Putin suddenly announced a visit to Vietnam. What does that have to do with China? Vietnam, another key player in the South China Sea dispute, has been going head-to-head with China over the Spratly Islands. Recently, Vietnam's island-building efforts in the South China Sea have reached half the scale of China's. If Russia gives Vietnam a boost of confidence and backs their stance in the South China Sea, China's position could get a whole lot tougher. If a military conflict breaks out in the South China Sea, Vietnam might have to side with the anti-communist bloc. They wouldn't just aim to seize Chinese-controlled islands, they could ramp up their military presence in the Gulf of Tonkin and even stir up trouble along the China-Vietnam land border. This would force China into a two-front war, splitting their troops and resources. And if the South China Sea ignites, the Taiwan Strait, the Korean Peninsula, and the China-India border will likely flare up too. too, putting China's coastal cities at risk. Right now, the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, isn't ready for such widespread warfare. They're all talk, but when it comes to action, they've got to think twice. But make no mistake, they are planning to use force in the South China Sea, just not yet. They're waiting for the South China Sea Code of Conduct, but not for long. Because the US and Philippines are prepping to drill for oil in the Spratly Islands. If US drilling rigs show up, it'll be a huge problem for China. If China misses this window of opportunity, they might not be able to fight in the South China Sea at all. Chinese Foreign Affairs Minister Wang Yi's visit to Malaysia is also an attempt to sway a former US ally to China's side in the South China Sea dispute. But the US won't just sit back and watch. If a conflict breaks out, all the issues with their current military equipment will be laid bare. For instance, China's Navy might have a decent number of destroyers, but those so-called advanced phased array radars might only work at half their claimed range, or even less. Last year, during Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, the PLA sent J-16D electronic warfare planes to track her, but they were easily suppressed by an old US Growler electronic reconnaissance aircraft. This shows that China's touted military strength might not hold up in actual combat and could even expose more weaknesses. China's missile guidance and control technology should also be cause for internal concern. Missile performance heavily relies on chips, and China's chip manufacturing is still lagging. This could directly affect missile control, signal reception, interception, and execution of commands, weakening their interception and counter-interception capabilities. In other words, China's air defense and missile systems might have significant flaws. In radar, missiles, air defense, and many other areas, the PLA might face serious issues. If they go to war, it may become that their confidence and bravado is all for show. Even though the situation at the Second Thomas Shoal is tense, the likelihood of an all-out war breaking out is pretty slim. It's more probable that all sides will keep up the military standoff while continuing their strategic maneuvering. Real fighting will only start once those strategic plans are in place, and we're still a ways off from that. Up next, the global trade landscape is getting a massive overhaul, with the US snatching away many of China's former top spots.